Modern Journalism by Richard M. Weaver. No one is prepared to understand the influence of journalism on the public mind until he appreciates the fact that the newspaper is a spawn of the machine. A mechanism itself, it has ever been closely linked with the kind of exploitation, financial and political, which accompanies industrialism. The press is the great scribe, possessed of that preponderance of means which technology always provides. The ease with which it multiplies stereotypes makes it the ideal servant of progress. It thrives on an endlessness of dissemination. Its progeny, like the frogs of Egypt, come up into our very kneading troughs. But just because the mechanical victory of the press is so complete, we are likely to ignore the conditions on which its work proceeds. I serve notice, therefore, that we here approach a question of blasphemous nature, a question whose mere asking disturbs the deepest complacency of the age, and that is, has the art of writing proved an unmixed blessing? The thought challenges so many assumptions that to consider it requires almost a fresh orientation in philosophy. But we must recall that it occurred to Plato, who answered the question in the negative. With him, it concerned the issue of whether philosophy should be written down, and his conclusion was that philosophy exists best in discourse between persons, the truth leaping up between them, like a flame. In explanation of this important point, he makes Socrates relate a myth about the Egyptian god Thoth, a mighty inventor who carried his inventions before King Thamos, desiring that they be made available to the people. Some of the inventions the king praised, but he stood firmly against that of writing, declaring that it could only be a means of propagating false knowledge and an encouragement to forgetfulness. Socrates adds the view that anyone who leaves writing behind on the supposition that it will be intelligible or certain, or who believes that writing is better than knowledge present to the mind, is badly mistaken. Now, Plato was disturbed by written discourse because it has no reticences or proprieties toward different classes of persons, and because if an individual goes to it with a question in his mind, it always gives one unvarying answer. And we find him making in the seventh epistle the extraordinary statement that no intelligent man will ever be so bold as to put into language those things which his reason has contemplated, especially not into a form that is unalterable, which must be the case with what is expressed in written symbols. Obviously, here is a paradox, and the present writer is aware of risking another in a book which calls attention to the sin of writing. The answer to the problem seems to be that written discourse is under a limitation, and that whether we wish to accept that limitation to secure other advantages must be decided after due reference to purposes and circumstances. In the good society, it is quite possible that man will not be so dependent on the written word. In any case, for Plato, truth was a living thing, never wholly captured by men, even in animated discourse, and in its purest form, certainly never brought to paper. In our day, it would seem that a contrary presupposition has grown up. The more firmly an utterance is stereotyped, the more likely it is to win credit. It is assumed that engines as expensive and as powerful as the modern printing press will naturally be placed in the hands of men of knowledge. Faith in the printed word has raised journalists to the rank of oracles, yet could there be a better description of them than these lines from the Phaedrus? They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome, having the reputation of knowledge without the reality. If the realization of truth is the product of a meeting of minds, we may be skeptical of the physical ability of the mechanism to propagate it as long as that propagation is limited to the printing and distribution of stories which give one unvarying answer. And this circumstance brings up at once the question of the intention of the rulers of the press. There is much to indicate that modern publication wishes to minimize discussion. Despite many artful pretensions to the contrary, it does not want an exchange of views, save perhaps on academic matters. Instead, it encourages men to read in the hope that they will absorb. For one thing, there is the technique of display, with its implied evaluations. This does more of the average man's thinking for him than he suspects. For another, there is the stereotyping of whole phrases. These are carefully chosen, not to stimulate reflection, but to evoke stock responses of approbation or disapprobation. Headlines and advertising teem with them, and we seem to approach a point at which failure to make the stock response is regarded as faintly treasonable, like refusal to salute the flag. Especially do the journals of mass circulation exploit the automatic response. So journalism becomes a monstrous discourse of Protagoras, which charms by hypnotizing and thwarts that participation without which one is not a thinking man. If our newspaper reader were trained to look for assumptions, if he were conscious of the rhetoric in lively reporting, we might not fear this product of the printer's art. But that would be to grant that he is educated. As the modern world is organized, the ordinary reader seems to lose means of private judgment, and the decay of conversation has about destroyed the practice of dialectic. Consequently, the habit of credulity grows. There is yet another circumstance which raises grave doubts about the contribution of journalism to the public weal. Newspapers are under strong pressure to distort in the interest of holding attention. I think we might well afford to overlook the presence of advertisers upon news and editorial policy. This source of distortion has been fully described and is perhaps sufficiently discounted. But there is at work a far more insidious urge to exaggerate and to color beyond necessity. It is an inescapable fact that newspapers thrive on friction and conflict. One has only to survey the headlines of some popular journal, often presented symbolically in red, to note the kind of thing which is considered news. Behind the big story, there nearly always lies a battle of some sort. Conflict, after all, is the essence of drama, and it is a truism that newspapers deliberately start and prolong quarrels, by allegation, by artful quotation, by the accentuation of unimportant differences. They create antagonism where none was felt to exist before. And this is profitable practically, for the opportunity to dramatize a fight is an opportunity for news. Journalism, on the whole, is glad to see a quarrel start and sorry to see it end. In the more sensational publications, the spirit of passion and violence, manifested in a certain recklessness of diction, with vivid verbs and fortissimo adjectives, creeps into the very language. By the attention it gives their misdeeds, it makes criminals heroic and politicians larger than life. I have felt that the way in which newspapers raked over every aspect of censored name, life, and personality since the end of the war shows that they really have missed him. They now have no one to play Antichrist against the bourgeois righteousness they represent. In reviewing the persistent tendency of the newspaper to corrupt, I shall cite a passage from James Fenimore Cooper. Though Cooper lived before the advent of yellow journalism, he seems to have stated the essential situation with a truth and eloquence impossible to improve on when he said, in The American Democrat, "As the press of this country now exists, it would seem to be expressly devised by the great agent of mischief to depress and destroy all that is good, and elevate and advance all that is evil in the nation. The little truth that is urged usually urged coarsely, weakened and rendered vicious by personalities, while those who live by falsehoods, fallacies, enmities, partialities, and the schemes of the designing find the press the very instrument that the devils would invent to effect their designs. 100 years later, Huey Long made a statement of impolitic truth when he called his tax on newspapers a lie tax. How, in the light of these facts, can one hesitate to conclude that we would live in greater peace and enjoy sounder moral health if the institution of the newspaper were abolished entirely? Jefferson observed at one time that it would be better to have newspapers and lack a government than to have a government and be without newspapers. Yet we find him in his 70th year writing to John Adams, "I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much the happier." The Russians, with their customary logical realism, which ought to come as a solemn admonition to the Western mind, have concluded that freedom to initiate conflicts is not one of the legitimate freedoms. They have therefore established state control of journalism. If newspapers can do nothing but lie, they will at least lie in the interests of the state, which, according to the philosophy of statism, is not lying at all. Certainly, it remains to be seen whether the Western democracies, with their strong divisive forces, can continue to allow a real freedom of the press. In limited areas, indeed, there are now signs that the day of that freedom is over. We see this silently arising in the appearance of the press agent and the public relations officer. More institutions of every kind are coming to feel that they cannot permit an unrestricted access to news about themselves. What they do is simply set up an office of publicity in which writers skilled in propaganda prepare the kinds of stories those institutions wish to see circulated. Inevitably, this organization serves at the same time as an office of censorship, de-emphasizing or withholding entirely news which would be damaging to prestige. It is easy, of course, to disguise such an office as a facility created to keep the public better informed. But this does not alter the fact that where interpretation counts, control of source is decisive. During the Second World War, the United States government set up a vast office of war information, the object of which was to interpret the struggle from the point of view of an administration which had been all along pro-war. In this day of skilled competition for public favor, even separate departments of government have their public information services. I shall illustrate by citing in some detail from a recent press dispatch from Washington. The United States Navy, which in pre-war days hid its light under a bushel, has decided to embark on a high-powered publicity program. Its plan, the account goes on to say, is to gather a staff of 500 men, the duties of which will be to provide photographs, radio programs, and other public information about the Navy. The development resulted, it is explained, from a realization that during the war, the publicity machines of the Army and the Army Air Forces were able to capture public support to the detriment of the Navy's reputation. In the course of the war, this candid correspondent declares, the Navy made some effort to get in step with the times when it introduced modern advertising agency methods and discarded the traditional name of Office of Public Relations for the more euphemistic Office of Public Information. Such is the policy of seeing that there is enough news and that it originates in the proper hands. The practice is becoming universal. Not only departments of governments and private businesses, but even universities have concluded that freedom of access to news turns out to be expensive and embarrassing.